The glass room was slick with salt, even on the inside. My palms kept slipping on the brass rail as the Fresnel lens turned with that deep, mechanical hum I'd already started to hate, low and steady, like the tower had lungs of its own. Out beyond the black rocks of Cape Fortune, the ocean looked wrong. Not rough, not calm, organized. Every wave struck stone with the same thin clicking sound, as if something under the water was setting the rhythm and the whole shoreline had agreed to keep time. The beam swept west, swept south, then it broke pattern, not a fault, not a stall. It pulsed. 3 short cuts of white across the water, a pause, then one long burn that I hadn't programmed and hadn't touched. The control board under my hand stayed dead steady, no alarm, no fluctuation. The motor kept turning, the lens kept humming, but the light itself had decided to say something I didn't understand. And the ocean answered. Miles of dark water came alive in strips and patches of cold blue fire, not random bioluminescence, not churn from surf, but a response. The same rhythm. 3 short, 1 long. The pattern spread farther than my eyes could hold. It ran beyond the rocks, beyond the shoals, beyond the edge where black water became black sky. The radio cracked. Then my own voice came through it, flat and close, as if I were standing behind myself. You missed the interval. I froze with my hand on the controls. I hadn't spoken. The radio hissed again, and I heard myself draw a breath I hadn't taken yet. That was the moment I finally understood Fergus Sweeney hadn't gone strange at the end. The question was why he'd written rules telling me not to stop any of it, and it had started the afternoon I unlocked the tower. The inheritance itself sounded practical enough when the paperwork came through. Fergus Sweeney had died in late winter, quietly, in the small house just inland from the Lighthouse road. The property transfer had been a mess, mostly because nobody expected him to leave the tower equipment logs, the house, and the service responsibility to me in the same breath. But I was the only surviving family he had left, and I already worked on marine electrical systems up and down the coast, so the arrangement made a kind of bureaucratic sense. Temporary maintenance, site review. A decision later on whether the old lighthouse would stay active in its current form or be folded into remote monitoring. I drove down from the ferry in cold rain, in with the sea air thick enough to taste before I even saw water. Cape Fortune had always felt exposed to me, even when I was a kid. Nothing between the land and the Atlantic but wind, rock, and whatever nerve you brought with you. The tower stood where I remembered it, white and narrow and older than any shape that clean had a right to look. The lantern room caught the late light in dull panes. The keeper's house crouched beside it, low and weathered, with every window shut tight. Salt stuck to my face within minutes of stepping out of the truck. It wasn't blowing hard enough to explain that. The damp just lived there, clinging to skin, working into your clothes, settling in your mouth. Etta McIsaac met me at the harbor office before I made the drive out. She'd handled local access after Fergus died, and she was the only person who spoke about the lighthouse like it was still part of the county instead of a landmark people photographed on postcards. She was older than I'd expected, broad-shouldered, deliberate, with the kind of stillness you only got from decades near weather mean enough to punish fidgeting. She slid the key ring across the desk and watched my hand close over it. "Official manual's already there," she said. "That's the one you follow." It felt like a strange thing to stress. I asked if Fergus had left anything else. Her eyes shifted just once toward the office window, past me, toward the water. "Plenty," she said. "Doesn't mean it was meant for you." Then she added, "If the mechanism sounds off, you'll hear it before you see it." At the time, I took that for ordinary local phrasing, and the sort of thing people said about old equipment. I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count since. I still don't know whether it was advice or apology. Inside the keeper's house, everything smelled sealed but not dry. Old paper, wool, machine oil, and underneath it all that constant mineral tang of the sea. Fergus had always been meticulous. Even in his last years, when the family stories started using words like forgetful and difficult, nobody ever accused him of neglect. The kitchen drawers were labeled. Spare bulbs were wrapped and stacked by type. The workbench in the shed had tools laid out in straight lines so exact they looked measured. The tower key turned hard in the lock. The door opened inward with a sticky groan, and the first thing I heard was the lens. Not the beam, the hum, low, rhythmic, confident. And the Fresnel assembly above me revolved with a mechanical patience that filled the stairwell. The sound carried down through the iron spine of the tower and into the soles of my boots. Under that hum, faint enough that I almost dismissed it, came another rhythm from outside. Click, click, click. Not from the light, from the rocks below where waves were striking in intervals, so even they sounded rehearsed. I climbed. The lantern room was cleaner than the rest of the place, but it felt subtly wrong in a way I couldn't name. The alignment marks on the service panel didn't quite match the lens housing. The control board showed stable output, yet the sweep timing lagged half a breath behind the motor rotation. It was operational. More than that, it was healthy. But the system felt like a well-fitted door hung on a warped frame. Every part worked. The whole didn't sit true. The official Coast Guard manual was clipped beside the board in a plastic sleeve. Its guidance for the active beacon was simple and unsurprising. Maintain a consistent light rotation cycle at all times. Report any irregularities in beam function immediately. Do not alter programmed signal intervals. Taped under the shelf, hidden unless you bent down to check wiring, was a smaller book wrapped in waxed canvas. Fergus's handwriting covered the first page. If the light begins to pulse on its own, do not correct it. When the ocean lights up, turn away from the window. If you hear your voice on the radio before speaking, shut it off and wait. Never let the beam complete a full cycle during a red tide. I laughed when I read it. I'm ashamed of that now, but I did. Not because it seemed frightening, because it seemed pathetic. The sort of superstitious field note an old man wrote when isolation started sanding the edges off his mind. Fergus had spent more hours alone in that tower than most people spent in their own kitchens. I told myself anyone could start assigning meaning to quirks after long enough. Still, I read the list twice. Then I checked the wall clock in the lantern room because I wanted something normal to look at. It was running 3 minutes slow compared to my watch. I reset it, made an entry in the site log, and started a full systems inspection. The damp got under my shirt before sunset. By then I'd checked the motor housing, replaced a corroded connector in the backup panel, cleaned old residue from a contact bank, and convinced myself the subtle misalignment was just age plus poor retrofitting. I cooked in the house after dark, keeping the kitchen radio low. The window over the sink showed a strip of ocean beyond the grass, black as slate. Every so often the lighthouse beam swung across it and laid a white bar over the glass. It should have felt familiar. I'd worked remote marine sites before. Buoys, shore stations, one miserable foghorn relay out near Digby that screamed every 40 seconds for 4 straight days while I replaced half its control cabinet. Isolation didn't spook me. Machines didn't spook me. Old notes written by proud men who didn't want their work changed didn't spook me either. But that first evening I kept catching myself listening between sounds. For the hum overhead, for the clicks from the rocks, for anything else that might belong to the same rhythm. I didn't understand what I was noticing yet, and I only knew the tower felt less like a structure I'd inherited and more like a process I'd stepped into halfway through. That was the first upgrade to my understanding. I'd come in thinking the lighthouse was a place. By nightfall, I knew it was behaving like an instrument. My first night on duty should have been a formality. The weather held clear, the current reports were unremarkable. and the beacon motor was tracking within acceptable limits after the small adjustments I'd made. I brought a mug of coffee up to the lantern room around 11:30 and settled into the metal chair by the service panel with Fergus's waxed journal on the shelf below me, where I'd left it face down. The room smelled of hot metal and brine. That shouldn't have been possible. The windows were sealed, the vents were filtered, but the salt-heavy dampness kept collecting anyway, film by film on the glass, on the railing, on my lips when I licked them. The lens turned through its cycle with that same low hum, one steady mechanical note rising and falling as the prisms caught light and sent it sweeping over the sea. Outside, the dark was deep enough to flatten distance. The rocks below vanished except when the beam crossed them. Then they flashed white and were gone again. I was looking at the motor indicator when the beam hiccuped, just once. A fractional stutter. Enough for the light to thicken on the water instead of moving cleanly across it. The motor didn't slow. The housing didn't shudder. The board showed no fault. But the beam itself lost its cadence as if somebody had put a finger on the light and held it for less than a second. Then it happened again, and this time with spacing. Short, pause. I set the mug down so fast coffee splashed over my knuckles and went straight to the controls. Manual said report irregularities immediately. Manual said do not alter programmed intervals, which to anyone who'd actually worked equipment like this meant you corrected drift but didn't improvise new timing without authorization. So I opened the timing interface, checked the sweep register, and forced a recalibration. The lens completed one clean rotation, then the ocean flickered. At first I thought it was a boat wake catching the beam, something disturbed near the rocks. But the light wasn't white. It was blue, pale, and cold, and coming from beneath the surface. 3 patches flashed in sequence off the point, then a longer band farther out. Not random, not wave tops, pattern. And I stepped to the glass before I remembered Fergus's note telling me not to. The water below the tower was dark, but 30 yards beyond the rock line. Veins of bioluminescence opened in the sea like somebody had drawn a shape under black silk. They flared, dimmed, then shifted position with a precision that made the skin on my arms tighten. I'd seen plankton bloom before. Everyone around the coast had. But bloom followed turbulence. It spilled and smeared. This was responsive, discreet. The light came alive exactly where the beam had just been corrected, as if my recalibration had reached into the water and touched something that touched back. Then it stopped. The surface went black again. The only sound was the hum of the lens and the distant measured clicking of waves on rock. I stayed at the window long enough for my coffee to go cold. What bothered me more than the flicker itself was the delay. The response hadn't followed the pulse as much as answered the correction. That implied more than sensitivity. It implied relation. I went back to the panel and checked the output logs. No spike, no voltage anomaly, no visible explanation. The record looked clean. If I'd taken a photograph of the readout and sent it to any inspector in the province, they'd have told me the system was behaving exactly as designed. That detail seemed minor. I've thought about it every day since. Around 1 in the morning, I went down to the equipment room below the lantern chamber to inspect the cable feed and found salt crust along the inner frame of the sealed relay cabinet, thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. The gasket was intact. No leak, no condensation trail, just a white residue spread in branching threads across metal that should have stayed dry. I checked the second cabinet. Same thing, only lighter. The air in that room felt wrong too. Cold, but wet. Like standing inside a coat someone had worn in freezing rain and hung up without drying. I scraped a bit of the residue onto a rag, meaning to test it later. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. That's the part people don't understand when they talk about fear after the fact. Competence doesn't disappear because something impossible happens. It just keeps moving while the rest of you lags behind. Back upstairs, the beam held steady for nearly an hour. I started to believe I'd corrected a minor timing glitch and startled some naturally occurring bloom into visibility, and I even reached for Fergus's journal with the intention of putting it away for good. Then the clicking outside changed. Still rhythmic, still wave against rock. But closer together now, more exact, not the natural mess of surf. It sounded like a row of hard knuckles tapping glass from very far away. I looked out and saw the beam sweep west, south, east, then pause. The motor hadn't paused, the light had. A short flash struck the water below the western shoal. Another, then darkness. I lunged for the control board and overrode the cycle again, harder this time, locking the sweep to its programmed rotation and holding it there until the manual indicator stabilized under my hand. The beam obeyed. Clean arc. Clean arc. Clean arc. Out on the water, the blue fire came back all at once, not in patches now, but in a broad, in thin line that curved along the edge of the shoals like the outline of something enormous turning over in its sleep. I remember the exact feeling in my mouth. Copper from the coffee gone stale, salt from the air. That low taste of adrenaline that felt electrical more than physical. Then the line in the water broke into points, and each point went dark one by one as if something out there had noticed I was watching and closed its eyes. I spent the rest of that night in the lantern room with the official manual open on my lap and Fergus's note beside it. One told me to report irregularities. The other told me not to correct them. The contradiction stopped looking like senility around then. It started looking like a disagreement between people who thought the lighthouse was for different things. By dawn, I had upgraded my understanding again. I no longer believed the beam merely illuminated the ocean. Something in the ocean was reading it. The radio started with my breathing. That was what woke me on the second night, slumped in the chair under the service panel with my neck cramped and the lamp in the corner gone dim. A soft inhale through static, then another. Close enough to sound like a microphone was held against someone's mouth. I sat up. The room was gray with pre-dawn cloud, the glass streaked white with salt, and the beam was still moving in its calm, patient sweep. The radio unit by the log desk hissed once. Then I heard my own voice say, "Switch to backup if it drops again." I hadn't spoken. I hadn't even thought the sentence yet. The sound of it hit me strangely hard, not because it was a perfect imitation, and because it was exact. Same cadence, same flatness I used when I was tired and focused. It sounded like a recording from the inside of my own head played half a second too early. I stood and crossed the room before the thought had fully formed. My hand went to the mic. The radio crackled again. "Don't answer." My voice, again. This time with a thin wash of static under it like it was coming through seawater. I yanked the power switch down. The speaker cut dead. For a moment, the only sound left was the hum of the Fresnel lens and the dry scrape of my sleeve against the desk. Then faintly, I heard my voice continue anyway. Not from the radio. From inside the dead speaker housing or behind it or in the metal of the desk itself, I still can't say. It wasn't louder than a whisper. It just persisted where silence should have been. Wait. That one word. Nothing after. I backed away from the desk and nearly knocked into the wall clock. That was when I noticed the second hand. It moved 3 ticks, stopped, jumped forward 2, held, then started again as if nothing had happened. I checked my watch. Same minute, different seconds. The room felt smaller all at once. I remembered Fergus's rule exactly as he'd written it. If you hear your voice on the radio before speaking, shut it off and wait. For the first time, I followed one. I didn't touch the controls. I didn't answer the mic. I stood in the middle of the lantern room with the salt sticking damp between my shoulder blades and counted breaths while the tower kept time around me. The second hand on the wall clock skipped again. Outside, the waves clicked in synchronized little bursts. Inside the dead radio, my own voice made a soft shape against static, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping person. I couldn't make out the words. After maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5, the whispering stopped. The wall clock evened out. The room returned to the familiar mechanical rhythm of lens, motor, surf. Whatever had pressed against the moment withdrew. I checked the radio housing. No hidden receiver. No residual power in the line. I opened the back panel, traced the feed, confirmed the switch was genuinely dead. Everything in me wanted a fault tree. Cross signal from a nearby vessel. Delayed transmission. Some freak interference rolling off the weather band. But none of those explanations accounted for the timing. It wasn't an old recording of my voice. It was speech arriving before the thought that made it. I know how impossible that sounds. I've heard myself say it back in interviews and statements, in the careful, cleaned-up language people use when they want an extraordinary account to stay within ordinary categories. You can flatten anything if you take enough of the life out of it. What happened in that room wasn't audio interference. It was sequence interference. That was the upgrade. The system around the lighthouse didn't just respond to action. It could slide ahead of it. Later that morning, I found the site clock downstairs skipping too. Not the same pattern, just enough lost seconds to leave me checking my watch every few minutes. In the kitchen of the keeper's house, the kettle clicked off before the water boiled. On the porch, the beam crossed my boots a breath before I saw its reflection move over the grass. All tiny things, all deniable, and all of them wrong in the same direction, toward anticipation. I pulled Fergus's waxed journal out again and read the first pages more carefully. The opening entries were ordinary maintenance notes, lens cleaned, fuel line checked. Fog rolling from southwest. Then the tone shifted by degrees I only recognized after the fact. You can't let it use your timing. That line had no context. Neither did the next. If the interval reaches you first, keep still until it passes. I read those sentences 6 times, annoyed more than frightened because they were written like conclusions to conversations I hadn't heard. Fergus had never been a poetic man. He wrote plainly, almost stubbornly. If he started sounding cryptic, it meant either his mind had gone or the subject refused plain language. At that point, I still wasn't ready to choose the second option. Near noon, I stepped outside and stood on the seaward side of the tower with the wind pushing damp through my jacket. The ocean looked normal in daylight, gray, cold, restless white on the rocks. Gulls worked the air above the point. The beam, nearly invisible in the brightness, still swept through the lantern room overhead. Nothing glowed, nothing answered. But every 7th or 8th wave hit the rock line with that same hard click, as if there were hidden cavities under the water filling and emptying in perfect order. I started mapping the intervals in my notebook because that was what I knew how to do. Measure, compare, build a pattern out of observation until the thing stopped feeling supernatural and started feeling technical. And that impulse probably kept me alive longer than panic would have. It also carried me deeper in than ignorance might have. By the end of the second night, my model of the hidden world had shifted again. The lighthouse wasn't just being observed by something offshore. It was caught in an exchange. The beam, the radio, the clocks, even my own speech were all being drawn into the same timing system. I should have left then. Looking back, that was the last moment I could have walked away and been only confused. Instead, I looked out over the water the next night and saw the shape of the thing. The rule said to turn away from the window when the ocean lit up. I didn't. Not fully. I wish I could pretend that came from courage, but it was curiosity with a professional mask on. I'd spent 2 days watching effects. I wanted mechanism, and I wanted one clean look that would tell me whether I was dealing with rare biology, environmental interference, or the slow unspooling of whatever had taken Fergus at the end. The weather helped me make the mistake. The evening came on clear and windless, and the sea beyond Cape Fortune flattened into broad, dark plates divided by threads of foam. The air was heavy with the smell of kelp and cold iron. Even inside the lantern room with the windows latched, that salt-heavy dampness clung to my face and hands as if I'd just come in from spray. The Fresnel lens rotated through its cycle with a deeper hum than usual, almost contented. I noticed that. I don't know why I thought a machine could sound contented, but it did. A little after midnight, the first patch lit, far northeast of the shoals, too far for wave churn to explain. A blue oval opened on the surface and held, then another farther west. Then a line between them, thin as thread from that distance. My throat tightened before I moved. Not fear exactly, recognition. The same feeling you get when a half-seen diagram finally resolves into something intentional. I should have turned away. Instead, I killed the room lamp, stepped close to the glass, and watched. The beam swept over the water, and every time it crossed one of the glowing patches, another answered farther out. Not at random, in sequence. The ocean was building a geometry from the light. Triangles at first, or what looked like triangles from shore, then longer lattices spreading across the surface in angled bands. The synchronized clicking from the rocks below grew louder, no longer hidden by surf, and it sounded like 100 little shells struck together in measured sets. I grabbed the binoculars hanging by the window and looked farther. The world opened. What I'd taken for isolated patches were only the nearest points in a system extending miles offshore. Cold blue nodes blinked in coordinated rhythms all the way to the horizon, and beyond that, where my eyes should have lost them, I could still sense continuation in the timing. The lighthouse beam wasn't falling on disconnected water. It was passing over one segment of a network so large my brain kept trying to shrink it into something local and failing. That was trigger one, though I didn't have a name for it then. Scale. Not the fear of one thing in the dark, the fear of realizing the dark is organized, and I tracked the pulse for several sweeps and started matching it against the timing log I'd been keeping. The intervals aligned. When the beam held a fraction longer on one arc, distant nodes shifted in response. When the sweep returned to standard, the grid corrected. The geometric shapes weren't decorative, they were syntax. That thought came to me whole and uninvited. Syntax. I still remember how unnatural it felt to apply language to water. The more I watched, the less the sea looked like habitat and the more it looked like tissue, a living medium carrying signals from point to point. The bioluminescent entities themselves never rose high enough for a clean look, but the behavior told its own story. Distributed response, local precision. No central body I could identify, and yet a clear collective intent. And it wasn't one organism making shapes. It was countless small lights behaving as if they shared a mind, or perhaps participated in one larger than any single body could hold. Then the pattern widened again. The nodes nearest shore dimmed in a sweep from east to west, and a new set ignited beyond them. Farther than the lighthouse should have mattered. For one breathless second, I understood that Cape Fortune was not the center of the system. It was one relay, one translation point on a coastline that might hold others. That opened loop too, whether I wanted it open or not. How long had this been happening? Not here tonight. Not with Fergus. Not even with the modern automation panels and maintenance logs. The scale on that water implied repetition over decades at minimum, more likely generations. In networks like that didn't appear by accident, and they didn't stabilize around one old tower in a single season. The wave clicks below shifted again. 4 in a row. Pause. 4 in a row. I looked down through the glass toward the black water at the base of the rocks and saw thin blue traces in the foam itself, not bright enough to glow unless the beam crossed them. Filaments. Little lines moving against the pull of the tide. Swimming, maybe, or being carried in ways tide charts didn't account for. One detail more. The entities weren't just out in deeper water, they came right up to the stone. I stepped back too fast and banged my hip on the panel. The beam swept on. The grid held. For the first time since arriving, I felt not watched, but used, not personally, structurally, the way a wrench is used. And a lighthouse keeper is supposed to believe he guides traffic, prevents wrecks, keeps systems reliable. Standing in that room, smelling salt where there should have been only dry metal and oil, I started to suspect reliability itself might be the danger. I shut the curtain over the western window with shaking hands, then the northern one. I left the southern pane uncovered only because I had to keep an eye on the beam. That single act felt ridiculous and necessary at once. When I finally looked away from the water, blue afterimages were still printed across my vision in hard little points and lines. On the service panel, the status lights seemed too deliberate. Even the red standby lamp looked like part of a grammar. I slept an hour before dawn and dreamed in intervals. By morning, my model of the hidden world had upgraded again, and I no longer thought something offshore was merely reacting to the lighthouse. The lighthouse was a node in a communication system far larger than Cape Fortune, and the sea itself was carrying the message. Fergus's journals were kept in 3 places: the waxed notebook in the lantern room, 2 ledgers in the desk downstairs, and a stack of oilskin-wrapped pads hidden under the floorboard beneath his bed, where the wood had been loosened and put back so neatly I almost missed it. If I hadn't heard the hollow change in the plank when I stepped beside the bed frame, I might never have found them. The smell that came up when I lifted the board was old paper and trapped sea damp. Not mold. Something cleaner and sharper, like salt dried on rope. The pads underneath were dated in Fergus's hand across nearly 30 years. Your early entries were exactly what you'd expect from a keeper. Weather, bulb replacements, fuel deliveries, passing vessels noted by class and approximate heading. Then, scattered among them at wider and wider intervals, came pages that didn't fit any ordinary maintenance history. Translation cycle unstable during fog. Manual timing preserved outbound signal but distorted return. Correction event at 2 in the morning. 2 vessels altered course without weather cause, no collision, still feeding. That last word stopped me. Feeding. He never underlined it, never elaborated, as if the meaning had become too obvious to him to require explanation. I turned pages with my fingertips gone cold despite the damp heat of the room. More notes. Signal drift strongest during red tide. The official interval is not for us. I do not let them teach the coast to speak clearly. I sat on the bed with the ledger open across my knees and read until the light in the room shifted from gray to afternoon white. Outside, the tower hummed through the walls. Inside, the house held that same sealed dampness that never dried. The pages left a fine powder of salt on my fingers where they'd absorbed years of air from the point. Then I found the entry that changed Loop 1 from suspicion into certainty. It was written across 2 facing pages dated more than 15 years apart in the same month. The earlier half described a service inspection team bringing updated protocol binders. Standardized timing, central reporting, improved consistency along the coast. Fergus's writing was dry and annoyed, the way men write when bureaucracy interferes with craft, and the later half began in the same hand. They know enough to preserve it. Halfway through the sentence, the handwriting changed, not gradually, not with the normal drift you'd expect from age or fatigue. One word upright, the next cramped and slanting hard left, pressed so deep the nib nearly tore the paper. Same pen, same line. Different person if you looked only at the marks. They know enough to preserve it, and I know now they do not care what it preserves. I stared at that line until the letters blurred. It wasn't just that the official rules contradicted Fergus's private ones. It was that the contradiction had purpose. The manual didn't exist despite the hidden system. It existed in support of it. Maintain consistent rotation, report irregularities, do not alter intervals. Those weren't neutral operational safeguards, and they were instructions for keeping the translation clean. That was trigger 2. Betrayal, not by one person, maybe not even by people who understood the thing in full, but by an institution old enough to carry forward a practice after forgetting why it began. The manuals looked like safety, Fergus's warnings looked like madness. In reality, the sane-looking rules kept the machine fed. By then, I'd also found references to older towers. Not many. Fergus was careful. He wrote in fragments, maybe to keep any one page from becoming too clear. But the hints were enough. Old stations farther up the coast had gone dark after misfires. A keeper in another county learned the return channel too well. There'd been relay losses whenever a lens house burned or a light was decommissioned without replacement. One note, I'd written in the margin of a weather report, said simply this: it was using lighthouses before radio, before standard time, maybe before anyone named the county. That answered part of Loop 2 and made the rest worse, over a century at least. Maybe much longer. The tower at Cape Fortune wasn't an adaptation bolted onto a modern natural phenomenon. It was one phase in a relationship between coastal infrastructure and something marine, intelligent and patient enough to outlive individual keepers without changing its method. Late in the day, I climbed back to the lantern room with 3 journals under my arm and read them there so I could compare Fergus's notes to the active panel. The beam swept. The hum held steady. Outside, the ocean wore daylight innocence again. It took effort now to believe it. I found a passage near the end of the most recent pad where Fergus wrote about correction events. At first, I thought he meant maintenance. He didn't. He meant ships making inexplicable navigational choices under clear conditions. Small errors, tiny course deviations, enough to bring hulls over rougher water or delay them into fog or draw them toward channels they'd normally avoid. Not catastrophe every time. That wasn't how a stable system would feed. It would take what it needed in increments, nudging traffic just enough that misjudgment, weather, and tide finished the work. Not shipwrecks as spectacle, navigational error as harvest. I said that out loud in the empty lantern room and hated how right it sounded. That was when I understood Fergus hadn't been trying to save everyone. He'd been introducing static. In small acts of interference, let the beam pulse when it chose. Turn away when the return signal surfaced. Shut off the radio when your own voice arrived ahead of you. Break the cycle during red tide. None of it destroyed the system. It only degraded translation, reduced precision, made the network less efficient. He'd been sand in the gears. And I, following the official manual, had spent days cleaning those gears for it. The sun went down while I was reading. I didn't notice until the lantern room windows stopped reflecting the interior and started opening onto black water again. By then, my understanding had upgraded in a way that made the earlier nights look naive. The official protocols were not there to protect ships from the sea. They were there to help the sea speak through the light. And the red tide came in on a smell before I saw the color. Anyone who's spent time on the coast knows that thick, iron-rich stink when the bloom rolls up, mineral and sour and faintly sweet in the back of the throat. It reached the tower at dusk, carried on a damp wind that left my skin tacky within minutes. By sunset, the water around the shoals had taken on that murky, rust-red cast under the last light, beautiful in a way that made me suspicious on sight. Fergus's final handwritten rule sat open on the desk where I'd left the journal. Never let the beam complete a full cycle during a red tide. The official manual was clipped beside the panel. Maintain a consistent light rotation cycle at all times. By then, I knew enough to understand the conflict and not enough to know which failure would kill me. That's the worst kind of knowledge. Not ignorance. Partial understanding with consequences. The lens hum deepened as night came on. I could feel vibration through the floor plates under my boots. The timing display held steady for the first half hour, then began to creep. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Just a subtle acceleration in the sweep, each rotation shaving away fractions of a second. The beam crossed the dark windows a little faster, then faster again. My own breathing started trying to match it before I caught myself. I reached for the control board and stopped. If I obeyed Fergus, I had to interfere, break the cycle, refuse completion. But every nerve trained by years of maintenance work rejected deliberate sabotage of an active beacon in low-visibility biological conditions. The manual lived in my hands as much as in the binder. Consistency, safety, report faults. Hold the line. That, I think, was the real betrayal. Not that the official rules existed, that they wore the shape of responsibility so well. I kept the cycle steady. I told myself I was buying time, observing, confirming. In truth, some part of me still wanted the world to reduce itself to an explainable mechanism if I followed normal procedure long enough. The red tide answered almost immediately. Blue ignition points flashed beneath the stained surface, sharper and brighter than on any previous night. Not just beyond the shoals now, between them, around them, moving in coherent bands through the red water like veins suddenly lit under skin. The synchronized clicking from the rocks swelled into a rapid, brittle chatter, not louder only, closer, so close it sounded like it was coming from inside the tower walls. And the beam accelerated again. I forced it back to standard. The motor fought me. I'd never felt resistance like that in a timing governor. Not mechanical strain, counter pattern. Every adjustment I made seemed to be met from somewhere else in the system, as if the Lighthouse had acquired a second operator using a language of intervals instead of touch. I kept the rotation consistent, and the ocean started moving toward me. There's no elegant way to describe what I saw because the wrongness was in the coordination more than the sight itself. The bioluminescent bands didn't surge like waves. They advanced in nested lines, each one appearing only after the previous line reached a certain point, as if the grid were folding shoreward by calculation. And the red tide made the water opaque except where the blue organisms traced the structure underneath. It looked like thought approaching through blood. Short sentences came then. They had to. The beam swept. The water answered. The tower vibrated. I smelled hot brass. Something below the windows clicked in fours. I remembered Fergus's warning too late. Never let the beam complete a full cycle during a red tide. Not because the bloom changed visibility. Because the bloom changed conductivity. Biological density, translation strength. The red water wasn't the threat by itself. It was the medium that let the network bridge distances it normally couldn't. The beam reached the northern pane, south, west. The cycle neared completion. Outside, the nearest blue lines gathered around the base rocks and held there, not smashing against them. Not dispersing in tide, just waiting in place as if some command had paused them at the threshold. I saw little vertical sparks in the foam, thin rods of light rising and dropping. Bodies, maybe. Or clustered filaments lifting toward the stone. The room temperature dropped all at once, not the whole tower. Just the lantern chamber, like a cold hand had been pressed over the glass. Then the radio, still switched off, spoke in my voice. "Don't let it finish." That broke whatever deference I still felt toward the manual. I went straight to the emergency brake wheel and hauled. The mechanism screamed metal on metal. The lens shuddered. The hum became a grind that traveled up my arms through the handle. The beam slowed. Below, the ocean convulsed, not physically, structurally. Lines that had held perfect spacing snapped into chaotic flare patterns. Blue nodes ignited and died out of sequence. The brittle clicking from the rocks dissolved into ordinary surf for half a second, then returned ragged and angry. I kept hauling until the rotation lagged badly enough to count the pauses without instruments. The motor housing spat sparks near the base plate. The smell of ozone cut through the salt. Another half turn, and the emergency brake would have locked the lens completely, maybe shattered the gearing, maybe dropped the whole assembly out of alignment for good. I was ready to do it. I think that's important to say. By then I understood enough to choose destruction over clean functioning. But something happened before I could. A voice floated up the stairwell below me. Not from the radio, not from memory. Human. Female. Calm. Callum Sweeney. If you stop it there, it'll remember the angle. Etta McIsaac stood in the doorway before I heard a footstep. That alone should have been impossible. The outer tower door had remained bolted since dusk. I'd checked it twice after the first radio incident. The stairs were iron, narrow, resonant as bells under boots. No one climbed them quietly. Yet there she was, one hand on the frame, coat damp at the shoulders but not dripping, hair pinned back exactly as it had been in the harbor office. The lantern room smelled suddenly of wet wool and harbor rope on top of salt and hot metal. I didn't let go of the brake wheel. How did you get in here? She frowned as if I'd asked the wrong question. You already asked me that. Her eyes shifted to the beam, then to the window, then back to me a fraction late. Like her attention was stepping across stones the rest of me couldn't see. The timing of her expression was wrong, not jerky, offset. She was living a few seconds to one side of the room. The red tide strengthens the return, she said. Fergus Sweeney figured that out before most of them. If it closes a full sweep now, they'll pin the relay to the tower. After that, you won't be keeping time. You'll be supplying it. My mouth had gone dry. Most of who? Etta McIsaac gave me a strange look, pity mixed with irritation. The keepers, Callum Sweeney. The ones who thought the light was for ships until it taught them otherwise. Then she finished the sentence I had only just begun to form in my head. And no, I don't know whether the Coast Guard understood all of it. She stopped. Really stopped. A hard stillness went through her face, as if she'd just heard herself from very far away and couldn't place the voice. Her hand tightened on the frame. Her pupils widened. I said that already, she whispered. For the first time, she sounded afraid. That was the foil reveal, though I didn't have language for it then. Etta McIsaac wasn't merely a witness or a reluctant local keeper of secrets. She was out of sequence with me in the same way the radio had been, only worse. A person carried forward or backward along the timing channels the Lighthouse used. A temporal echo, not dead, not exactly alive in the ordinary flow either. The ocean below flared blue so bright the room flashed with it. Etta McIsaac flinched and looked past me to the southern pane. You corrected it too often, she said, and this time there was grief in her voice, old and tired. He spent years making it stutter. Then she stepped toward the brake wheel. I almost stopped her. That's what I think about now. Not what I did, what I nearly did. Some reflexive trust in another human body inside the room. Some remnant belief that if two people worked a mechanism together, the world might go back to behaving like a machine. But Etta McIsaac's hand passed over the wheel before it touched. Not through it. Over it, wrong by inches, as if she and the metal occupied adjacent versions of the same space. I let go. She looked at me with sudden clarity, more present in that second than she'd been since appearing. Don't watch the water when it learns you, she said. Then the lantern room door banged open behind her, though no wind entered, and the next sweep of the beam crossed the stairwell. When the light moved on, and Etta McIsaac was gone. No footsteps down, no latch, nothing. Only the hum of the damaged lens and the red breathing dark beyond the glass. My understanding changed again in that room. The hidden world did not merely use lighthouses and water. It could carry human minds or human timing the way it carried light. Keepers weren't just operators. They were vulnerable components. After Etta McIsaac vanished, I did the first thing that felt fully mine since arriving. I stopped thinking like a maintenance technician. Not entirely. I still used the tools of the job, but the job itself had changed under my hands. The question was no longer how to preserve a functioning lighthouse through abnormal conditions. It was how to interrupt a translation process that was already using the tower, the beam, and possibly me as parts of its grammar. And the red tide thickened outside until the sea looked black only where it wasn't lit from beneath. The blue grid advanced and collapsed in repeated attempts to regain the precision I'd broken with the emergency brake. The damaged Fresnel lens still turned, but unevenly now, whining on one side of the cycle and lagging on the other. Every time the beam hesitated, the ocean answered with a corrective flare. Every time it smeared, the nodes offshore reorganized. And because Fergus Sweeney had spent years leaving me testimony instead of instructions, I finally understood the shape of the system all at once. The maximum revelation didn't feel like a flash of insight. It felt like a lock turning with 8 different teeth engaging at once. The lighthouse beam was not a guide in the old human sense. It was a translator, converting mechanical regularity into a pattern the bioluminescent collective could propagate across the ocean's surface. The entities themselves were too distributed, too numerous, and too bound to the water to maintain long-distance precision without a shore-based amplifier. Lighthouses solved that problem. They provided elevated, repeatable light with standardized intervals visible across weather and distance. Once enough stations along a coast shared dependable timing, the collective could treat them as signal towers. That explained why the official manual insisted on consistency. Standard intervals made clean translation. Report irregularities immediately because drift meant noise. Do not alter program signal intervals because the program was the language scaffold. In the artificial regularity, the network needed to talk across miles of moving water. It also explained Fergus's rules, every one of them. If the light begins to pulse on its own, do not correct it. Because that was the return signal surfacing in the beam, the ocean speaking back through the translator. Correcting it didn't stop the exchange, it clarified it. When the ocean lights up, turn away from the window, because direct visual tracking let the pattern sync with the observer. Not mind control in any dramatic sense. Calibration, human perception pressed into service as another timing reference. That was why the geometry had felt linguistic. I wasn't just looking at it, it was measuring how I looked back. If you hear your voice on the radio before speaking, shut it off and wait. And because the network could carry your own probable speech ahead of you once it had enough of your cadence. Not prophecy. Prediction refined by timing. The radio, like the beam, was another translation surface. Never let the beam complete a full cycle during a red tide, because the red bloom increased biological density near shore, strengthening the relay between distributed ocean light and the tower. A full cycle under those conditions didn't merely transmit, it closed a circuit. And Etta McIsaac. Etta McIsaac had not simply wandered into the lighthouse at the wrong time. She had been caught by the system the way a voice is caught in an echo chamber, preserved as sequence more than flesh. Maybe she was still alive somewhere in ordinary time. Maybe I'd met the current version of her in the harbor office, and the tower had given me another, displaced along the network. Or maybe the woman in the office had already been living with fractures in her timing for years. I still don't know. What I do know is this. When she finished my sentence before I spoke it, she wasn't guessing. She was arriving from the next beat over. All of that landed while the tower shook gently under my hands and the salt damp on my skin turned cold. I looked back over everything and saw the earlier scenes change shape. The salt residue inside sealed rooms wasn't a leak. It was ocean presence carried inland by translation, particulate proof that the boundary between tower and sea had started dissolving. The clocks skipping seconds weren't faulty. Local time inside the relay point had begun slurring under competing intervals. Fergus's handwriting changing mid-sentence wasn't madness, it was contamination by return signal. Maybe he'd been writing during a translation event. Maybe another version of his own timing had crossed the line with him. And the feeding. That part settled into place last because I'd resisted it hardest. The collective didn't need dramatic wrecks every night. It fed on navigational errors the way an intelligence might feed on usable mistakes. A ship reading a light fractionally wrong. A captain trusting a sweep that had been translated instead of simply seen. A vessel delayed into weather by one corrected interval, one minor deviation, one choice nudged by clean coastal signaling that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with sustaining the network's access to human movement. Traffic became resource, confusion became nutrition. Lighthouses didn't only amplify the collective, and they helped shape the maritime flow it fed from. Fergus Sweeney had learned enough to interfere. Not destroy, interfere. He'd introduced noise, protected his own perception when the sea lit up, refused predictive loops and broken full cycles during red tide. Year after year of making the Lighthouse just inaccurate enough to starve the system of perfect translation without attracting formal shutdown. Then he died. And I came in with clean hands and proper training and restored the relay for it. The guilt of that has a texture. It feels like cold brass after rain. The room gave a sharp metallic groan as the damaged lens crossed its weakest point in the rotation. I snapped out of the revelation and moved. Knowing the system wasn't enough, if I let the beam finish stabilizing under the red tide, the network would close the relay regardless of my understanding. The blue grid outside had already resumed forming higher-order shapes, longer chains, more distant synchrony. The ocean had not lost patience. It was adjusting. I opened the motor casing and pulled the service schematic only long enough to confirm what I already suspected. The governor linkage controlled rotational continuity, but the optical completion of a full sweep depended on the lens carriage reaching one exact alignment point on each cycle. Fergus's wording had been precise. Never let the beam complete a full cycle. He didn't say stop the light. He said prevent completion. That meant asymmetry, not darkness. I grabbed the wrench roll, braced my shoulder against the housing. Ian loosened the carriage guide on the south arc until the lens began to drag just before the terminal alignment. The beam still moved, still illuminated, still served as a visible navigation light in broad terms. But every near-complete sweep now caught and smeared off angle, turning the final clean segment into a broad, useless fan of light over empty air instead of a precise closing pass over water. Outside, the ocean grid stuttered, not once, repeatedly. Whole lanes of blue ignition failed to connect. The synchronized clicking from the rocks broke apart into scattered impacts. Farther offshore, distant nodes blinked out of pattern, then vanished altogether. The collective had depended on closure, on the lighthouse completing the sentence. I denied it the final word. The response was immediate and awful, not because anything came crashing through the windows, but because the room itself tried to recruit me harder. The dead radio filled with layered whispers in my own voice, dozens of near-identical Callum Sweeneys speaking the same phrase at slightly different offsets. The wall clock spun ahead 3 seconds and dropped back 2. Reflections in the lantern glass lagged behind my movement by half a beat. In one pane, I saw Etta McIsaac standing by the door again, though the doorway was empty when I turned. I kept working. Tighten, check drag, force misalignment, hold. My hands bled in 2 places where sharp brass caught the skin, though I barely felt it. The salt air found the cuts immediately and burned like wire. Beneath the floor, the tower vibrated with a low resonance that matched no mechanical frequency I knew, and it felt alive in the soles of my feet, not heartbeat. Chorus. I remember saying out loud to Fergus or to myself or to the sea, "You don't get the whole cycle." The whispers on the radio stopped. So did the clicking on the rocks. The silence that followed was worse than noise. Total. Thick. The kind that makes your ears strain so hard they invent sound to fill it. Then the ocean went dark. Not all at once. Node by node, band by band, the blue lattice beyond Cape Fortune failed and receded into black water. The red tide still stained the surface. The beam still turned in its crippled, incomplete sweep. But the organized response was gone. No more geometry. No more answering pulse. No more sense of immense coordination extending beyond the horizon. Just surf and darkness and one damaged lighthouse scraping its way through the night. And I stayed in the lantern room until dawn with the wrench still in my hand. Nothing else surfaced. Nothing else spoke. When morning came, the sea looked exhausted. I made the descent in a body that felt older than the one I'd climbed up in. The keeper's house was cold and wet, every fabric touched by salt. Fergus's journals lay where I'd left them on the kitchen table. I packed them into a canvas bag, took the official manual too, and locked the house behind me. On the porch, I turned back once toward the tower. In daylight, with gulls cutting the air and the grass bending in an ordinary wind, the lighthouse looked simply damaged. A maintenance issue, a report, a cost estimate. Nothing in its silhouette admitted what had used it overnight. At the harbor, Etta McIsaac's office was dark. That detail still bothers me more than it should. And not because it proves anything definitive, because it refused to. The key rack inside the window held fewer rings than I remembered. The door was locked. No note, no vehicle out front. I stood there with Fergus's journals under my arm and listened for any movement inside. Nothing. I did not knock. Maybe I was afraid she would answer. Maybe I was afraid she wouldn't. I filed the lighthouse damage report in the driest language I could manage. Mechanical instability in lens carriage. Emergency interruption during harmful algal bloom conditions. Site unsafe for continued manual operation without full inspection. Recommended suspension of active service. Every word was true. None of it was enough. I left out the ocean grid, the voice on the radio, the displaced timing, and the way the official rules had functioned as support for something older than policy. Not because I thought no one would believe me, because belief felt like another way of joining the system. By noon, I was driving away from Cape Fortune with the windows cracked despite the cold because I couldn't bear the trapped smell of salt in the cab. In the rearview mirror, the lighthouse shrank to a white mark against rock and sea. I kept expecting the beam to catch the truck windows, but daylight held it down. That closed the main action cleanly enough, at least on paper. I left. The tower remained standing but crippled. The relay at Cape Fortune failed to complete its cycle. The red tide passed. No shipwrecks were reported that week. No strange public notices went up along the coast. And the world above the surface went on as if none of it had happened. I did not go back. Not because I was afraid of the place itself, though I was, because once you understand that a system can hide inside the shape of ordinary guidance, you stop trusting guidance. Traffic lights at wet intersections, flashing lane arrows in roadwork, reflections from office towers at sunset. Any repeated signal in glass or water now feels less innocent than it used to. I can't sit in a restaurant facing a harbor window. I turn televisions off if a scene lingers too long on blinking towers at sea. At night, I cover mirrors if a street lamp outside catches them in intervals. That's the permanent change people always want described in larger words than it deserves. Not trauma, calibration. I check for pattern where other people see light. As for Fergus Sweeney, I think he understood the cost better than I did. He never tried to expose the system. He tried to degrade it just enough to keep it from using him completely. Maybe that was the only victory available. Maybe inheritance in the end wasn't the house or the tower or the journals. Maybe it was the burden of noticing when a signal is too precise to be harmless. And Loop 3 never closed for me. I left the lighthouse. I know that much. I crossed land. I slept inland. I changed clothes that still smelled faintly of iron and brine. I put miles between myself and Cape Fortune. All of that happened in the physical world I can verify. What I can't verify is whether the system let me leave as a person or kept me as a reference point. Sometimes I hear my own voice in half-dead speakers just before I decide to say something. And sometimes the second hand on a wall clock hurries to meet my glance. And sometimes when sunlight scatters in a puddle or a train window or the bottom of a drinking glass, I catch myself waiting to see if the reflection will answer before I move. I still don't know if I escaped the network or if I'm one of the ways it keeps watching shore.